Hello and welcome to the Wanderings podcast. My name is Pedro Bonatto and today I am at the legendary Siwa Oasis. And after a nice vacation, I am here to walk in with you and have this episode in a traditional Siwi house. And just for context, this is the land where Alexander the Great, 2,300 years ago, came in search of enlightenment and experience. And in a way, that's sort of what I'm doing, which is why this episode that is all about vision in the plan is shot in the oasis of Siwa. And today I am at the Kafur house here at the Siwa Oasis in the northwest part of Egypt. This place is basically 50 kilometers away from the border with Libya. There is a great desert that is literally the border between Egypt and Libya. And this place is this huge place that is an oasis, as the name suggests. And it is very interesting in terms of history, and that's why I wanted to record this particular episode here. If you know a little bit of history, you will know that Alexander the Great, 23 centuries ago, actually came to the Siwa Oasis. He came to the oracles in the Temple of Amun before he continued on his journey. He had a very deep connection to this place particularly. And this place has been inhabited for thousands of years since the Neolithic period. And now they have the Siwi Berbers that are actually a tribe. They're basically a population of about 20,000 people that live here. And it has been over the last few decades becoming a more touristic destination because of the beautiful, amazing dunes, the clear skies, the natural waters that come from the ground. And you have both hot water and cold water, and there's a lot of salt here too. So there are these famous pools of people can go and swim in a very salted water that makes you float. It's absolutely fantastic. And this episode will be about a vision and a plan. It's basically, in a way, it's a continuation of episode 24, although they're certainly not in order. But I felt compelled to record it here, right after I finished my vacation, which I haven't had in, 8 or 9 years, a proper vacation. And we decided to come here to Siwa Oasis, to stay here at Kafur House in this, they call it Eco Lodge, I think. It's like most of the rooms are very bare bones, and I really liked this particular room where Jan and I are staying. And I wanted to record it here. Sometimes you will see that I will record in very beautiful places. And this to me is actually incredibly beautiful because they made these houses very much in the style and tradition of the Siwi people here. And so they're made of this like mud bricks, and they are very, let's say, bare bones, improvised. They will have the modern comforts of electricity and sometimes air conditioning, depending which room you get. But I really wanted to have that experience here and to share this idea of this episode with you in this particular location. Let me take a moment to actually thank Kafur House for hosting me and Yana in these basically almost 20 days here. What became as a vacation and then as content creation for ourselves became almost like a residency in the place. I really admire what they did, and they created a very cool place that has rooms like this, and it has some that are like more fancier. They have like more comforts if you're into that kind of stuff. It has a very nice swimming pool. It has the natural thermal waters. They can arrange all sorts of activities here in Siwa. The prices are great. They really employ the local people. So it's a very cool way to do business. I'm very happy to shout them out. My hope is that this episode will give you a little bit of inside baseball on my plan for this podcast and for my vision for my work in general for the next 5, 10, 20 years. But it's sort of like a work in progress on my own journey of finding what I actually like to do. And I hope that me sharing my process will basically spark some ideas on your own journey. So there will be a lot of inside baseball of like my plans for the podcast, the things that I want to do, my thinking process behind them, how it connects to all my other activities as a photographer, videographer, musician, designer, and all the rest. But I think it would be also cool because a lot of people ask me, and especially staying here, so many travelers come particularly to this location and they have all these stories to share. And they keep asking me, okay, how do you do a podcast? And I want to make it perfect this way or that way. So I had at least 4 conversations while I was staying here with people that had similar visions, and then I will actually share this so I can point to this episode to everyone that asks me, okay, how do I create a podcast? How do I make videos? Like all those things on a more practical level, I'll mention here. But this is sort of like this vision in a task idea. It's both a consideration of dreams and the ways to make them exist. And I'm making this in this very, say, traditional house, very bare bones. Here you will see already a few things that I got in my travels here. And for example, there is a nice pillow that Yana got, and those are patterns that are from the Siwi folks. And I should mention that the Siwi Berbers, they are very much related to other tribes in North Africa, which are called Berbers, like in Algeria and in Morocco. And they actually have their own language, which is distinct from the rest of Egypt. They have their own rhythms, they have their own instruments, their own music. And I was very fortunate to start learning a few of them, including the ney, their version of the ney, which is a flute. And I was taking some classes with them. I got my little carpet that is like a piece of carpet that I always wanted to have when I sit on the sand or sit somewhere. I wanted to have a little place where I can sit and drum. And I couldn't find it in Turkey when I was going there a few years ago. And here I found the perfect one in the little store. And it's those little things that we bring and those connections with people that are like my passion, that I think are so cool. And being able to have this, let's say, very informal, nice conversation with you here in basically my room in the desert, in the Siwa Oasis, is what I'm very much looking forward to. So with that, I wanted to start. Usually I do a quote at the end of the episode, and there will be that as well, but I wanted to start with one that was in one of David Allen's books. He is the creator of the GTD methodology. There is a whole episode about my breaking down of his vision, and his work keeps coming back again and again into the work that I'm doing. And I wanted to start by mentioning this quote that he talked about, that he saw in a church in Sussex, England. And the quote goes as follows: "A vision without a task is but a dream. A task without a vision is but drudgery. A vision and a task is the hope of the world." I think that's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful quote. I think it's very much related to episode 24, when I created this new incarnation of the podcast, where I talked about the idea of choosing projects. And this is like a natural continuation. Okay, now you chose a project, what's next? And I will give that as the example of what I'm doing with this podcast and with my work in general. And maybe that will help unlock a couple of things for you. And maybe you will even have better ideas of being part of this community and try to basically show me things that I do not know. I have always been very interested in the idea of being a Renaissance person, of being interested in so many projects, in so many different areas. And just to give you an idea, I have worked as an actor, then as a photographer, as a photojournalist at first, then work in fine art and in fashion and other commercial kinds of work in photography. I had an audiobook company. I taught English. I started learning physics. I actually ended up almost finishing an undergraduate program in physics because I thought I wanted to be an astronomer. Not the case. Then I actually went to work with science popularization in the Ministry of Science and Technology in Brazil. So I was basically a government employee for about 4 years. Then I did a master's. I worked as a designer. I worked as research assistant. I worked in now this online learning area. I worked as a musician. I worked as a photographer. I worked as a set dresser in movies. So I had a lot of experience in a lot of different areas. And the problem for me has always been, okay, how do I combine them all together? I never wanted to say, okay, I am a photographer, just a photographer, or just a musician, or just fill in the blank. And I always thought this was a weakness, a person that had all these interests, like, oh, if I actually focused in one thing, I would become like really good at that thing. And I think there is merit to that. But at the same time, my interest is in not only mixing cultures and mixing ideas from past and from the present, but also having my fingers in different pies, let's say, and wearing different hats. And I did not know how to get all those things together in one kind of cohesive vision. Over the years, it's sort of like stabilized as these manifestations of self, sort of like manifested in photography and music, and a little bit of videography too. But I see videography as an extension of photography. Some people that I know that are cinematographers, they actually think the other way around. It's like they think in moving images and then they go into the still. For me, it's actually the opposite. And the idea of music also came first as playing traditional music, then mixing traditional songs, and now composing music as well. And then I also got interested in installation art, which will be my next thing. It was like as if I was adrift in the ocean or lost in the desert without knowing which way was the oasis, in a way. And for a long time, I will say that I was really lost. I was doing lots of different activities, but I could not see the mission. I could not see my purpose. I could not see how they would all fit together and how I could actually make them work as a one thing. As I was considering all these possibilities with a mix of hard work and procrastination, I ended up discovering that I wanted to use this podcast as my vessel, as my pirate ship, since I do not have a house and I don't have a place that I can call home yet. I would say this is my ship. This is where I bring everything together and hopefully take you with me and make it inspirational and actionable and hopefully entertaining as well. And when that unlock came, it sort of like gave me this idea that we sometimes think, especially when you get to my age at 45, you start thinking of your heritage, of your ancestry. And I really never paid attention to that directly. And suddenly I noticed, well, my parents, my father is a writer and a journalist, my mother is a journalist and a painter. And so they always had this idea of, and I think I come from like a 5-generation lineage of journalists. So I was particularly not interested in just the journaling part of things, like of documenting other people's works, but the documentation of work has always been something very important for me, especially in photography, where I want to create something, but I want to talk about the things that were behind this as sort of like a documentation of self. And in a way that is very much the journalist blood running through my veins. And I always thought that the photography would be not enough if it was just a photo. But just the documentation of works would not be enough for me too. That's why I'm not a documentary filmmaker, because it's not in my blood, at least not for now, at least not in this incarnation. But I'm very comfortable with the idea of sharing the things that inspire me and with the hope that it will inspire you too. With that said, there's this great quote from Matthew Arnold, where he said, "We wander between two worlds, one dead and one powerless to be born." It's a very deep quote, it's a very, let's say, hard one, but to me it is actually very inspirational because it shows where we are sort of like in this middle ground, in this like no man's land where we try to make sense of what we want to become. And I really wanted to share this with you guys because I had started this podcast many years ago, and it was basically made to be about interviews with people that inspire me. And then a few years later, I started another podcast called Creative Walks, where I would walk around the city and give my ideas sort of like without notes. It was just a stream of consciousness. But I sort of stopped. I thought it was not interesting. At least I thought it was like, oh, what do people know? What would I have to give in terms of knowledge to people or ideas? It was a lot of lack of self-confidence. And my journey over the years to be able to find this, of reinventing this podcast, of the Wanderings podcast, was to actually share my journey of something new coming up. And then I decided to okay, I will commit this to it for a year. I hope it will be a lifetime project. I hope I can come back many, many, many years and decades from now and see this video and you thought you're going to do just for a year. But I thought, baby steps. Let's start with something, still big, which is a commitment for a year to have weekly episodes. But that was how I unlocked it. And I thought I'll bring everything here. I will bring my interviews, I will bring live shows, I will bring Q&A shows, I will bring my solo episodes. And I thought I want to make this economically viable. That was one of the main things that I wanted to make sure that it could happen, which is why I decided to make these little products like my postcards, the kind of merchandise that I'm creating, and have this be a way for people that enjoy the show, support the work, and make it a continuous thing. And this came in the context of something that Steven Pressfield, another author of The War of Art, that I mentioned in a few episodes, and I will come back to his work again and again. I highly recommend his book. And he said that the sure sign of an amateur is that he has a million plans and they all start tomorrow. Don't I know it? And since I decided to start this podcast, it has been a reversal of that idea. It's okay, I have all these ideas, but now they are laser focused in one product, which is the podcast. Of course, because of the nature of the work that I like, it will delve into all sorts of areas, which is fine, but it has one place to go, one place to get it finished. And my idea of actually getting it to be something that I developed throughout the course of a year, to see what it actually can become, came from a lot of inspiration from Gary Vaynerchuk. He is a marketer from the US. He has one of the largest marketing agencies and advertising agencies in the world. Very interesting guy. I highly recommend you take a look at his work. I hope to talk to him someday. And he said that people want to succeed so fast because they want to prove something to somebody else, which makes them vulnerable. And I think this is very true. Sometimes when we are in this limbo of projects, oh, should I do this, should I do that? Oh, but I wasted all this time. We get to this idea, okay, this needs to happen right away. So I need to make sure that the next thing will be the thing that redeems myself. Maybe you will recognize that tendency in your own work. And that actually, in my case, became a paralyzing thing because I wanted to do videos, I wanted to do photos, I wanted to do music, and I wanted them all to be perfect. And since I took so long to get started, now they actually have to be really perfect. And the way that I circumvented that was to make it in stages. And what do I mean by in stages? It's a podcast that will have me talking, it will have interviews, it will have images put on top of it. It will have some elements which will be, let's say, behind the scenes, a real behind the scenes of my work in photography, music, and whatever else I do, but it needs to come out consistently. That was the first narrowing. How consistent? Once a week for my solo episodes, once a week for my interviews or other kinds of shows. And that reminds me of a quote by Jocko Willink that is, the longest time in the world is the hesitation between thought and action. Again, my way around this was, and this will be a little bit more on the in-depth idea of how to create a podcast, and the way that I'm structuring this, it's as follows. I don't have a team to do a very complicated edit, which would be basically an hour-long documentary every week. I cannot do that. At least I don't know how to. And even if I had a big team, I don't know if that's what would be ideal in terms of what to do. Although this is what calls to me, make everything so beautiful and so amazing and so deep. But then I thought, no, I'll do this in layers. I will create the base episode, which will exist in audio and in video, which is basically either me talking or me talking to someone else. And I will do layered editing, meaning I will put the images that are necessary to make sure that the episode makes sense. If I'm talking about a photograph, I'll insert it right there. If I'm talking about a book, I'll put an image of the book or whatever else in terms of content that needs to go there. Then the third layer will be all the, let's say, visual doodads and audio and all those things that will add to the episode in terms of video, But since I have this idea of layer editing, in case it comes to the deadline of this episode coming out, I don't need to worry because the episode is done. And then the other thing that I did was I'm always recording at least 4 to 8 episodes ahead of time. So that would ensure the consistency and make it work. The other thing that happened was a click. When I came up with this idea of coming back to the podcast as a thing that I share my own ideas, my own version, my own understandings of the world, this thing clicked in terms of self-confidence. Not necessarily that the knowledge that I would say would be correct, but at least it's the best that I can do for now, and that's hopefully valuable. And I wanted to share this with you in this episode because I had, as I mentioned, a vacation for the first time in many years. And being a person that travels all the time, most people think that, oh, you're in vacation mode all the time. But actually there is a curse of being a nomad, or at least being a creative, even if you're not a nomad. That is, by creative, I mean as a professional that works with the creative fields. That is, everything is research. When I listen to a song, it's always repertoire. I always consider, how can I use this? If I see a place, I'm always in work mode, meaning, where is the sun? Should I record here? Can I do a partnership with this venue? That's a person that is going to be a model. This is a dress that I can use in one of my photographs. You're always working, in a way, which is great. I love my work. But over time, I noticed, and my wife too, that we forgot what it was to just chill. The other thing when you are self-employed, when you're like a small business owner, is that you pay for your own vacations, meaning you can see the bank account dropping because you're paying yourself. Like, it's not like you're paying a salary to an employee. It's anytime you're not working, you're not thinking about work, you are basically not making money, so to speak. Of course, that is a trap, but a trap that we fell into. And then when we were having our 9-year anniversary of our wedding, I said, you know what? Let's give ourselves the gift of 5 days that we are not thinking about work. And during this vacation, I actually had some very cool experiences, very unique, at least for myself, that they were firsts and they were very transformative, even if in a subtle way. One of them was to actually go and see the desert. There is a desert between here and Libya that I think is about the size of England, just to give an idea of how vast it is. And it's basically dunes everywhere. And then there is this oasis that happens naturally because of the underground water that exists here. As I mentioned, very important in terms of history of Alexander the Great. He has this references from multiple cultures coming back to this very isolated place. And he gave me this idea that, as I mentioned in the previous episode, I was talking about how to choose projects. And in a way, it's like as if we are in this desert and we don't know where the next source of water will be. And if we go in the wrong direction, we will end up dying. That's why it's so like nerve-wracking to, oh, I have to choose this path because what if it's the wrong one? I think that's a bad analogy in the end because we will find sources of water everywhere. It's different in the real world rather than in our minds. But there is this thing that even in the harshest desert, once you get a source of water, things starts to spring. And this was when I was looking at the sunset in the desert with Yana, and we were not worried about trying to create content. We knew that later on we would stay and actually do the work that we need to do here. But for those days, it was all about what we wanted to do, what I wanted to do, what she wanted to do, and what we wanted to do. And the other experience that was really cool that I had here was to actually sleep in the desert and watch the starry night, watch the sky with the Milky Way and all these constellations that I knew from books because I was used to the constellations from the southern hemisphere, and suddenly I was looking at the Big Dipper and all the other ones that only appear here in the northern hemisphere. And it was really cool to have that experience and to contrast that amazing view, this vision, as I'm talking about the vision and the plans in this episode. This is a perfect analogy because you are in contact with the most transcendent part, which is you don't fall into the sky because of gravity, and you're attached to this wanderer, which is the planet Earth. And why do I call wanderer? It's a Carl Sagan idea that the word planet actually comes from the Greek and then it means wanderer. like one that wanders through the sky, because the planets would have a different trajectory than the quote-unquote fixed stars in the background. That's for another episode, we'll talk about that. But we are attached to this wanderer, which is the Earth. And I was thinking about that. And also in the context of the desert, of the people from the oasis, of the Syri people that are here, of the Bedouins and of the Egyptians and all the people from all around the world that come to this place and have come to this place for many, many, many centuries, maybe millennia. How the desert life needs to be planned. Even little things, even today, like if you want to go to a restaurant, you sort of like have to order in advance the food so that they can go and prepare it for you. It's very different than in a, let's say, regular bigger size city. And in the desert, just like when you are in a very snowy place, when I lived in Canada, I saw actually some similarities to here, which is you have to be prepared and the worry about certain elements of safety. Although this is Egypt, different approach to safety, like not wearing helmets when you are on motorcycles and having, like infant right in front of you and maybe sometimes 3 or 4 people, but that's a story for another time. But what they have here is this preparation. There is the season for getting dates. There is the season for all sorts of activities here. You have to plan your day, you have to plan everything. And at the same time, it's very slow. And you have this abundant water that never ends to flow here. So this actually got me thinking about something that I am actively working on right now. If you're watching this episode, it's because I have done already at least 3 or 4 or 5 episodes that actually came out. So I'm actually in the process of doing this, which is how to fight the traps of tomorrow's perfection. And this is something that I got inspired by some people that I met here. For example, one traveler that I think he's about 60, he's retired, and when he was 20 something, he was actually doing this travel around the world, and he came back to the US and worked in like a regional manager for a company, and now he's actually traveling around the world again. And I was telling him about my experience, and then he had all these questions. Oh, how do you create a podcast? Why would you do a podcast? Why would you do like this or that? And then I thought, okay, I can actually share what I'm trying to do, which is what we're doing in this episode. And the other person that I met was a cinematographer from Brazil that was here in this same spot. And but she's a cinematographer, and she also does a lot of documentary filmmaking. And like me, she had, like, let's say the aesthetics are very important. So she was postponing doing some projects because of the aesthetic considerations. And I told her like that my approach was, okay, do the base and then create the layers of complexity, because you can always create smaller content later for social media so that people discover your podcast. And then if you want, which is what I intend to do with this podcast, is at the end of the year, have like a compilation of best moments, or eventually, hopefully, one thing that I would like to do is to have the Wanderings podcast be its own thing as a show. How about that? That would be great. That's sort of like what I'm considering. So now, let me give you a high-level idea of why am I focusing on the podcast, why am I focusing on the video element of the podcast as well. And this is because of the current framing of media creators in the 21st century, which is that video is the future of independent media. I grew up with film photography, and then it went to digital, and then it went from digital photography to be able to, as a photographer, to be able to actually do video as well, with the same quality, the same aesthetics. And I always wanted to live in these two worlds of commercial photography for companies that I believe in, and fine art photography, so that people can see directly the vision that I have, and that hopefully they will be inspired by that. Art as portals, as I sometimes mention. And I loved magazines. I loved going to airports and flipping through beautiful magazines, and especially in fashion photography, the beauty was that it was always an excuse to have a creative playground. Of course, you're trying to sell products, and of course, you're trying to showcase the creativity of the garments, but it has always been about this dream world. And that was what I was trying to bridge, this idea of fashion photography and fine art photography, as so many amazing photographers that I admire have done before. And now it's a little bit different, because we don't have magazines anymore. Like, the media is really changing. It's all about social media. It is different. And I was not very confident that my work as it was in Toronto until, let's say, circa 2018, 19, would exist now, especially if I am a nomad person going around the world. So video would be the future of independent media. And there was this thing that I love podcasts. I listened to podcasts since I was, I don't know, like since 2006 or 7, like really beginning of that. Before that, I loved audiobooks. I love the idea of documenting journeys. And I love the idea of reading books that are accounts from travelers, or not necessarily travelers, but people doing interesting things. It has always fascinated me. And then I thought, I am doing this. Why don't I share it with the world? That was the vision. The big vision of having a project that would stand on its own, which is this podcast, and have these other projects. Let's say I do a fine art photography series that will come and it will be documented in the podcast. I do fashion work for, like photography, fashion work for a company, I can feature it here. If there is a company that wants to work with me, and that comes the idea that I actually want to embed in these episodes right away, which is this new vision of advertising that is not based on the interruption of the show, but embedded in it. I think that is sort of like the future of advertising in a way that is very cool, very interesting. And it doesn't break the narrative, but it informs it. It's not like, okay, you're trying to see this, let me stop you and see this other things. It is necessary. It is still part of how YouTube works, for example. But I thought inside the sponsors for this podcast, I would love them to be integrated in the show. And that's what I'm striving to do, again, with no rush, trying to do step by step. What are the steps that I'm trying to do with this is, first of all, create my own products that you can buy. You can go to pedrobonatto.com/store. Here's a plug. And on my sponsors that I want to have eventually are the companies that I use, which is what I am mentioning to you as these episodes go. When I was coming up with this podcast, because it would be a lot of time and work dedicated to it for it to work, I had two main concerns. One, about my consistency. How would I be able to be consistent about this project and make sure that it comes out in time with quality? And the second was, how can I make it economically viable? And the way to do that was, as I mentioned, with my direct products and my sponsors. That's what I want to do. Eventually, I think that's the new format that independent media can prevail. I had to consider something that I think you have to imagine the best case scenario. That's an idea that I think it was both Jordan Peterson and Andrew Huberman and Tim Ferriss. Lots of people talk about this, that you need to have this push and pull tension when you're creating projects, when you have a vision. The vision needs to be the most blue sky vision, blue sky version of what you want to accomplish in a year, 2 years, 5 years, a la David Allen, to have like those altitude game of, at 50,000 feet, I want my vision of the world to be this way, or my world to be this way. And I will talk about some of those tools in a bit, but it also needs to have this other element, which is envision failure. What would happen if you failed at that? And I have never really done that. I've done versions of fear setting, which was what's the worst thing that can happen. Fear setting is an idea from Tim Ferriss. What would I do if it failed? What would happen if I failed? How could I mitigate that? So, which I've done that a couple times, but not consider, okay, if it fails, not how to mitigate, but what did it mean to me as having that as a failure? And I got past it when I considered I would have a body of work of a year's worth of content, of me talking, of the best recommendations that I could get, of the things that are inspiring me, showcasing my work. And I thought that would be cool to have on its own, even if the project had just a few hundred people watching. Because it's not really about how many people are watching, is can it be sustainable with the people that are interested in it? So that's how I went past that idea. So this is what I want to do with this podcast, with the work that I want to do over the next 5 years. And just a brief note on that, it is, first of all, to find where I'm going to live in the world, to start a family, to have kids, and to develop a couple bigger picture projects. One that is actually a full installation that involves music, dance, imagery, and that's a massive undertaking to be my life opus, I think. Write a book, create a couple more music projects and one educational feature. But that has to be a la Cal Newport, Deep Work, things that are done over time. And what I found with this idea of the podcast that was so obvious, but it was not to me, it was like, this is where I can show the journey of doing all those things, and this can be a product on its own. And that's the thing that I cannot express my gratitude enough to guys like Gary Vee, that he was actually saying, document, don't create. It's this trap the creatives have, that we want everything to be perfect, and then nothing exists because nothing will be ever perfect. And the perfection comes from the daily putting on. Even if you have a simple house with bricks like this, that people have been doing for at least 6,000 years. These houses, if you look at it, it reminds me of the houses in Cappadocia. It reminded me of the houses that people have done in Mesopotamia, the small places where life happens. That's why I wanted to record it here, this simple mud house. And it has all the luxuries of the beautiful life that is the life of achievement. Whoever made houses like this made civilization. And I think that's a cool idea to keep in mind. So now a couple suggestions. The first one is a book that I read, actually listened to many years ago, that in a way started my whole transformation process. I was still a government employee, and I was listening to this audiobook because I had such a strange view of what should be life. And the book is called How to Think Like Leonardo da Vinci by Michael J. Gabb. This book I listened to and read, I don't know, like at least 10 years ago, maybe more, actually way more. And it's very cool because it was the first encounter I had with someone that was actually defending the idea of the Renaissance person, and he was using the life of Leonardo da Vinci as a catalyst to approach life in a more creative way, which is in a way what I'm trying to share with you guys in this podcast. He has a bunch of interesting ideas, and I'll tell two of them. The first one, I think it's amazing, I do that even today, that he called a sprezzatura. And the sprezzatura is this idea of you put all these elements together in a page of your ideal life. Of course, today it became very fashionable, but this is an old idea. And what he suggests to do is to come up with this vision that even if you don't know how to draw, you can use like stick figures and like do mood boards, whatever versions of this, but you can create ideas that are all these elements, all these dimensions of your life that are work and personal related and family and spirituality and whatever. And it was the first encounter I had with an idea like this. Then David Allen talks about this, Cal Newport, all sorts of writers talk about this idea of imagining your life. And in this case, you actually make something out of it. You have an object that you can look at. And that was very useful for me when I was in that context of being a government employee that not happy with his job. And that was, some of the answers came from there. And even if I look back and what I put there, some ideas or things that I'm doing right now, they were there already. I just didn't know which manifestation they would have. So I highly recommend that element of the sprezzatura. And the other idea is that what he calls the Vincian principles. I'll mention them to you briefly, but it's just as an overview because I really like the way that they present ideas that you can incorporate in your life in different ways. One of them is called curiosità, which is curiosity, which is basically the idea of this podcast. Every time I mention follow your curiosity, and I think that's something that sometimes we forget, that we can just, oh, I'm interested in this, let me go see where it leads, before considering the pros and cons of things. The other one is dimostrazione, I'm sorry for my Italian, but it's demonstration, which is going principles of practical experience, which is the idea of experimenting, trying different ways of doing things, approaches of failure. And this is literally what I'm doing with this podcast. I'm recording my solo episodes, reflecting back on what happened, getting your feedback, coming up with new ones, coming up with the new interpretation of what an interview show is with like a co-host with Jana on the version of Artist Date, which was a show we used to have. And then it was very difficult to do every week. But then I said, okay, let's try to do this every month within the context of the Wanderings podcast. And that turned out like a nice thing to do. It's the idea of demonstration, like let's try it out, let's try it out. That's a very cool idea. The other one is he calls sensazione, which is sensations, which is a principle of sharpening awareness and senses. And this is something that when we are in your day-to-day life that is too much rigid and does not incorporate this particular element, we sort of like get set in our ways. And at least one of the advantages of being traveling all the time is that you have to put yourself in different situations. And here I'll actually mention something that I did now during this trip, which was to be, you're sort of like buried in this cave with salts on top of you. Supposedly they have this medicinal powers, I'm not sure about that, but at least it was a very interesting, nice sensation. And I always go to like flotation tanks and go into actually deeply think and enjoy the thing that you're doing. I do that with sauna and the contrast showers and all those things, but I think that's an important thing to keep in our mind, to keep our body guessing what's going on. The other, I love the word, it's called sfumato. Fumaça in Portuguese means smoke, so sfumato, I assume it has some Latin root of smoke. And the idea is to embrace ambiguity and this idea that we really don't know where things are going to go. You can plan as much as you want, and maybe it will be a good plan, but there will always be ambiguity in plans and in vision. Sometimes you have I have to come up with the best idea and perfect vision. No, you have to have the best vision you can for now. This is how I understand it. The other one, it's arte e scienza, which is art and science, which is you will balance creativity and analytical thinking. And this is one thing that literally I'm doing in this podcast, which is, okay, how many people are watching so that I can have an idea of how to monetize this show in terms of sponsors and what would be appropriate, what would be nice if people start watching the show and they support the work directly by buying products. That's a way to make it work. At the same time, I'm working on the creative element of I really want to see those things exist in the world, like the t-shirts and the bracelets and the postcards and all those things. And that is interesting in itself. And this idea of combining art and science is something that is at the heart of Renaissance thinking, that I think is something that should come back in a way today. Two more. One that he calls corporalità, which is physicality, which is the idea of having a healthy mind and having a healthy body. I am in the process of doing a major overhaul in my fitness. I'm still carrying about 10 to 15 kilos more than I should, but I'm working on it. And that's the other thing that happened here that was really cool. I met this guy called Abdul Hakan. He is from Sudan and he's a very young guy and he's really into physical fitness. He's missing his family, he wants to make them proud, and he got into this Arnold mold of really becoming a bodybuilder and making himself better. And I decided to collaborate with him to try to come up with a training plan for myself as I travel. That was something he suggested, and I thought, okay, you can I can be your guinea pig in that thing too. So there will be a full episode later on that I'll talk about this process of the before and hopefully after, a little bit different than today, about the physicality and how much that makes a difference in our lives. It's something that did not come naturally to me. I always had that idea that if you're going to be an intellectual person, you're not going to be like a meathead, and I could not be more wrong. And I think this principle that he talks about in how to think like Leonardo da Vinci is very cool. And finally, it's connessione. Connessione, I'm not sure how to say that, but it's the idea of connection, which is to see the interconnectedness between things, which is my life's mission. And that comes back to this idea of the execution and the division. To me, it has always been about the interconnectedness of cultures and ideas through time, both in the traditional sense of we have these traditions that have been tested through time, and the idea of art, which is what's new, what is necessary for survival that comes from the combination of tradition and creativity. That's what interests me. And then on a more cosmic perspective is we are in this pale blue dot, we're in this one planet, we're one species here, and the less we fight, the more chances we have of surviving over the long haul, which is subject for another episode. But I wanted to mention to you this particular book recommendation. I think it's amazing. And now I wanted to mention a couple more things. Thank you for being with me until now on the podcast. Let me switch the conversation a little bit now for showing you one of my photos that will be one of the photos in my postcard collection that is available at pedrobonatto.com/store. As we talked about, is a way for you to support the podcast, support the project, and it's sort of like these images from the mental landscape, from the road as I create them, and if they inspire you, you can purchase them at a very minimum cost that supports the show, and maybe something that you have that you can bring to your house or give to someone. But independent of that, let me tell you about this photo, because sometimes when you think about big visions and plans, or even if it's a small vision, a small plan, if we lived long enough, we had some sort of major failures. And these failures can come in all sorts of ways. And it's sometimes very hard to restart or to believe that things can be good again, or because something has been broken, how can it be put back together? And not only being back together, would it ever be as beautiful as it once was? That's one of the problems that we have, at least I had, trying to come up with projects after you failed and failed and failed again. And I was really inspired. There is this Japanese tradition called kintsugi. That is, when you get pottery and it breaks, they actually use gold and a couple other materials to mend it back together. It's sort of like this painting with gold. And it's not really painting, it's like gluing back together. And the idea is that you will proeminently show that the history of that object. And in a way, because it has these fractures, these scars, it becomes even more beautiful. And a couple of years ago, I had this idea that this could be something, I was thinking of heartbreak, I was thinking of like losing something in our lives. And I thought that this idea of the kintsugi applied to psychological motifs. So combining the ideas of fashion, beauty, and in this case gold, and an ancient tradition that comes back, I think from the 13th to the 16th century, they were doing that in Japan. I had this idea of making it a psychological kintsugi. So I got the model to have the scars painted as if it's scars on her face, in her chest. And my hope was that we can be seen as even more beautiful because of the things that we went through. That was sort of like the idea of that series. How does it apply to plans and visions? I think sometimes we get very conditioned to thinking that things should work out correctly the first time and they should be perfect just because we have a vision that the plans should be executed flawlessly. And I think these images that I'm showing you, they sort of like demonstrate that no, we're actually more interesting because of all this baggage, because of the mending of with gold. And I hope you find these images interesting and that they inspire you in your own kintsugi. I actually had that happen, like my clay drum that I got in Cappadocia. It got broken when I was in Brazil. Descendant of a Japanese girl, Brazilian girl, that does a lot of pottery work. She knew about kintsugi and she actually got my drum back glued together. Then it broke again in Egypt. And then in Egypt, a friend of mine was able to make it nice again. And the difference is that in that drum, they actually covered the wounds. And I know they're there, so it's okay. But even that, I remember feeling like, oh my God, I broke it again. I broke twice the drum. What the hell is wrong with me? And at the same time, now it's a story that I can share. And I play with this drum all over the world. Right now, it's waiting for me in Cairo for the next iteration. And speaking of drums and music, let me mention this week's song. There is a song by a band that I had the pleasure to play with a couple times called Ventanas in Toronto. It's led by Tamari Lana, that was actually interviewed for the Wanderings podcast before on its other iteration that had the DNA of music, where I was interviewing a bunch of musicians. Now it's all consolidated in one project, which is the Wanderings podcast. She's the band leader of Ventanas. Ventanas, if you know in Spanish, means sort of like windows, and it's windows through different landscapes, different worlds. And I remember that my journey through drumming, my journey through world music was dramatically changed when I met Tamar, I met Demetrios Pitsalakis and Jesh Singh, all musicians that were so amazing that really inspired me because they showed me all these other opportunities, other possibilities of combining music from different areas, which ended up informing my own band, the Blue Dot Ensemble, and their inspiration, both musically and as people, really got me on a path that I think it will be for life. So I have a great debt of gratitude for those artists, especially those three, but of course the whole band was really cool. And the song that I wanted to mention to you is a song called Primavera, which means spring. It's a composition by Demetrios and Tamar, and it has a little element of a traditional flamenco song too. It was recorded, there is a music video that I'm going to link here for you guys. And of course, remember that there is a playlist on Spotify with all the songs that I'm recommending here. I'm hoping to go all around the world with music that have inspired me, and I hope will broaden your horizons in terms of music with a little bit of history, a little bit of a personal touch. It's me showing you some cool songs from around the world, and I hope that's interesting. So this song, I thought it was so cool because we recorded it at my house in Toronto back when I was living there. I had a loft with Yana, and we basically decorated a whole studio. We actually had no furniture in our room. It was a mirror, a white wall for my photos, a big window, and that's our living room. And it really got transformed over time to do all sorts of shoots there, and this is one of them that we did of live with this song called Primavera, Spring. And I think I'm putting it here because it is such a hopeful song that hoping that the spring will come. And in a way, when we are considering a vision, it's like in the plan, it's sort of like we have the vision of something nice to come as the spring coming. And there are so many songs in different traditions that are all about the spring, that is literally this, let's say, water of creativity that so that we can harvest what comes out of our efforts. And so I thought it was cool to show you this song. It's a very cool song, very pretty, very nicely interpreted, and I did a video and they edit, so I hope you enjoy that. Okay, as promised, I will talk to you a bit about how to podcast and what the steps that go into it. And even if you're not into podcasting specifically, this will not take too long. And I think it's a very cool way for you to, let's say, have transferable skills, because maybe you don't want to do a podcast, but you're stuck with another project. For example, I'm a photographer and a musician. I was not originally a podcaster. There's all sorts of things that go into making a podcast that I did not know. And this has to do with this idea of a vision and a plan and how to actually implement it. And that's why I'm taking the time to actually talk to you about this here. Also, it is for me a place where I can point people to the philosophy of how to get things started the way that I do it. Because as I mentioned, sometimes people say, oh, I'd love to do a podcast, but I don't know how. So I will be using the Gary V joke here first, that he says, oh, you have to write down this website that has all the answers for what you need in this. It's Google, Google, right? So usually people laugh about that, but I think it's a very insightful idea, which is if you don't know how to do something, okay, maybe that information does not exist. What is dark matter? We don't know. We have to go talk to a bunch of PhD people all over the world, and they're scratching their heads trying to figure that out. Maybe the cure for cancer, how to stop global warming, all those things don't have answers that are very obvious. For all the rest, there are tools. And those tools are available virtually for free. You can pay a course, you can buy a book, you can do, and I recommend doing all those things if the information is good. But having that approach when you have a vision and a plan that you're going to have to create your own curriculum of how to learn this thing. And how you do this is just by going and searching for it. So let's be a little bit more sophisticated about that search, which goes way beyond the Google search. At least now in 2024, there are tools available for you to learn. The first one that I recommend is the one that I use all the time, which is Perplexity. It's an AI-based tool that searches the web and gives you information. You can literally ask questions. How do I start this podcast from scratch and use tools that are free? It will give you the step-by-step instructions. Give me YouTube videos that talk about the process of making a podcast from idea to publication. It will find you those informations, that information. You don't need to guess, and it's easier than you think if you are willing to spend 1 hour learning. Maybe it will take you a week, but you'll be surprised how much you can unlock by just one time. Okay, I don't know this. I don't need to be a PhD on this thing. I don't need to do a whole course, which is also another trap that happens a lot. So this is just me being a little bit more, let's say, bitchy about that kind of thing. But I know because I went through this as well. We have to be self-learners. If we're not willing to commit to try to learn on our own, there will be I call the bottom feeders, the people that, oh, there is like this 3 steps to do this thing perfectly and be a millionaire. Like you will fall prey to those kinds of things. And I would encourage you not to fall into those traps. With that said, let me tell you how I do this. And then maybe that will also give you a little bit of appreciation for the work that is being done. And I'll tell you about the parts that I don't know how to do yet, or that I'm trying to improve. The first thing to consider is that when you have a podcast, you basically have your own TV show and your own pirate radio program, because you can publish it and people all over the world can see it. In the example that I gave you of the interview that I did with Tamara Ilana, she was telling me that at some point she was in Sevilla, in Spain, and then, or I think it was there, and then someone said, oh, I know all about you because I heard you on Pedro's podcast. And I'm like, wow, I was really not consistent with that podcast, and that gift of putting it out there in the world for virtually for free for anyone that has like a phone eventually, or even a computer, or even go to the library and watch. It is available, and that's a glorious thing. That's why I recommend anyone that has something to say to go and create a podcast. Because your contribution, whatever kind of niche you have, will be useful. It will be cool. Now, I use a tool called Scrivener that I mentioned many times. That is a tool that I use for writing. So that is for planning my content, putting the links. And I also use Perplexity for research. Let's say there is a quote that I like. I have a collection on Scrivener of about 30,000 quotes that I gathered throughout the years. But sometimes I don't know what that quote was that I want to use on the podcast. I literally put what was Thoreau's quote about castles in the sky. What's the full context? What's the book? What's the page number? They will tell you. So it's like having an assistant, an amazing assistant for those research tools. So as you start using those tools, you will start incorporating it into your life, and it's amazing. Okay, so that's where I create the ideas for the podcast, but it needs to go somewhere, right? How does it go somewhere? Well, it needs to exist somewhere. So the way to do that is there are free tools. Again, you can go on Perplexity and search for all the free ones if you don't want to pay for it. But the first thing you'll need is a domain name. There's a domain name and there is hosting. Domain name is like whatever.com, whatever.org, whatever, right? It's the name of your company, the name of your website, the name of your, my case, pedrobonatto.com. I get that on Hover. That's the hover.com. That's the company I use for all my domain names. Some companies that host your website, meaning this is just the address, and now you'll have to build your house, which is the publishing of your website. And there again, there is Wix, there is Squarespace, there is WordPress, there's all sorts of companies that do this. I use Squarespace because I've been using it since 2012 when I started my website, and they have built in a podcasting feature, so you can create that on Squarespace. Wix has it, WordPress has it, although it's a little bit more engaged, technically speaking. This is fairly easy to do. And even if you get intimidated, oh, but I don't know all these technical things, if one fool can do it, another one can. It is easy if you were not born knowing it, but it's easy to learn. And then let's say that at some point you try to figure out and you can't do it, then you can hire someone to do it for you. But I think that will give you a disservice if you don't at least try to do it yourself first. Again, depends on the person. This is just my approach. I like to learn things, and I think those skills are always transferable, so they're never a waste of time. That's in my view of having this Renaissance person kind of ability, and also these are very simple things to do these days. So you got your domain name, you created your website, now you have to publish it on the website. So I use Squarespace. You could do it for free on Spotify, for example, directly. You can do your podcast right there. Advantages, disadvantages. I like to host my own stuff. And then you also publish it, if you do it on video, on YouTube. Another thing that is very cool if you're going to have a website is that you can embed, like connect payment services like Stripe and PayPal, so that you can sell merch, that you can sell products, that you can sell your services. If you are in a country, I'm very aware that I was living in Brazil, it's very difficult to have PayPal. Here in Egypt, it's basically impossible. I'll probably do a whole episode talking about the finances when you're not in one of the, let's say, first world countries. I used to live as a permanent resident in Canada, so I have a Canadian company, and now I have an American company. So that's something that I recommend to everyone. It's a company that is called First Base. I will leave links on the description, but you can create an LLC, a limited liability company, as a foreign person in the US. It will be your company, and you will be able to have a PayPal and Stripe and other forms of payment systems that you can get so that you can monetize your podcast. I'm mentioning this because I think it's very important, especially for people in countries where those services are not available. It's a way to free yourself and actually use some of the great things that the United States has, which is these payment services that were created there. Now for recording, I use my main camera. That is a 5D Mark III. It's a 12-year-old camera. It's my workhorse. I love it. I have all the lenses for it. I still love DSLR. I haven't really gone into the mirrorless cameras and with like electronic viewfinders. I really don't like it. I have one too. I have like a smaller camera, but I prefer my DSLR. And even better than that, I actually prefer my Hasselblad, that is like a medium format camera, but that I don't have it with me. I only rent when I have work for clients that require like a bigger frame. With that said, your phone will do it. You don't need to stress much about your camera system. Certain cameras will have longer play times, they'll have better autofocus, all those things. I wouldn't worry much about it. This is what I use. I also use a Rode microphone, like a transmitter, that is right now on the lapel of my blouse, and it goes to a recorder, a Zoom recorder that I also use to record music. It has 3, 4, 5 channels, depends on which one you get. You do not did this. You could put this directly on a lav mic and put it on your phone. You can get better audio with better audio equipment, but I think in the terms of getting started, you want to go as fast as you can so that you can get things out there, and then you share the journey, you get better microphones. I would love to get a better microphone than this lapel mic, but that's what I have right now, and I will not use that to not do the podcast, and it's good enough for now. For editing, I subscribe to Adobe Suite of the Creative Suite, and I use Premiere Pro and Audition to edit my audio and my video. With that said, you can always use Audacity. That is a free audio software. My wife even uses for her podcast, the Bella Dance Live podcast. She uses this for like 300 episodes. It's a free tool. She likes to use it. She got used to it. So in her podcast, it's audio only. On Windows, you'll have options for video, like there's like I think DaVinci Resolve that you can do video there. And again, take time, take 1 hour and learn the tool. That's what it will take. You don't need to be a super professional about it. You just need to know a few things to don't get intimidated by the tool. They are easy to learn if you allow yourself to learn it. And actually don't expect that you already know, you go and you practice. So I use Premiere Pro and I use Audition. I also use Photoshop. Of course, I'm a photographer, so I use Photoshop to create the artwork related to the podcast. I take a photo, I do videos, I do music, and I use Photoshop for my artwork, but you can also use a free tool like Canva that already comes with cool designs, cool fonts. You don't need to think much about it. It's really cool. Another thing, if you're considering, and that's what I do, monetizing your podcast through sponsors, it will be an ad read, it's a different thing, but you can have, if you're into like the creativity part of it, you can have merchandise related to your podcast. And with that, for example, I use on Squarespace because there is an integration with a tool called Printful. Printful is a company that does print-on-demand services. What does that mean? Let's say I have this t-shirt and I want to make t-shirts for the podcast, which I have. I create a design and I upload it to their system and they integrate with my store and they print on demand, meaning if a client buys, they quickly make it and then they send it to them. That makes me not having to have inventory because I'm traveling, so I cannot have it. And also they will have the quality control. That's one thing that it's cool to outsource. You put it to the professionals. You don't need to learn how to make a t-shirt unless you're into it. And eventually I will do custom made things that will be limited edition items for the podcast. Stay tuned for that, but this is how you do it. I have a book, so I'm actually working on another photo book, and for that I use Blurb. Blurb is a company that makes books, photo books, magazines. You can have it published. You could use Amazon's, I think it's called Kindle Publishing. That is like a self-publishing tool that it will make your book available on Amazon. And that's cool too, but I haven't used it myself. I still prefer to use Blurb. And so if I have a book, it will be created in Blurb because I really like the quality of what they do. And then I sell those products on my website. That requires a little bit more of a few extra steps to, okay, who bought what, send to print, send to the person. But again, it's just a few minutes and you can do it. I also use, because as you'll see on the Wonderings podcast, all the music, unless I'm talking about a song specifically from another person, I make all the music, I make all the sound effects and all that. And for that, I use a tool called Lander for AI mastering. And I publish my music using TuneCore. Again, all links will be on the description. This applies specifically to me, but it's just to give you an idea of the kind of work that goes into creating a podcast that is way more than me just sitting here. And finally, the thing that I still don't do because it's time consuming and to be honest, it requires some funding that I don't have yet. That is to have AI transcription tools and services and translation services. Not only AI, but they're human-based as well. And the beauty of this is that over time, this podcast can be transcribed and then translated for the people that do not have English mastered as their second language. And it's something that I'm very, very passionate about trying to do. So if you'd like to help the podcast by buying one of my postcards, by buying one of my songs directly on my website or through one of the streaming services, Apple iTunes, Spotify, and so on, consider doing that because all the money that I get for this podcast will go directly to actually increasing the production value of it. And this is the next step for me. I could, on a little note, on Adobe Premiere, you could ask it to do a transcription of your video and it will actually put subtitles. But I do not have the time for now to go through and make sure that everything is correct. With an AI tool, it will be possible, but they charge by the minute and I cannot do that as of now. So this is the next step for me. And also it's something that all those things I actually learned so that I could do the podcast and do other projects as well. So those skills are absolutely transferable. So that's the basis of doing a podcast. That's how I do these solo episodes. That's how I do my interview shows. That sometimes you will need also like Zoom or Zencaster or other tools for remote interviews. Or if I'm doing a live interview, I just put one mic on me, one mic on my guest, point the camera, and we start talking. That's how it goes. It's a lot of work. It's also a lot of fun. I really enjoy doing these shows. So I hope this gives you maybe an inspiration for creating your own podcast. If you do it and you got inspired by this, please send me a message on social media. I'm at Pedro Bonatto everywhere, or put a note here if this inspired you to start your own. I would love to check out what you're doing. And with that, let's continue with the show. I also want to mention now, in terms of other recommendations, I want to mention a couple things and then we'll be done. My follow of the week is a photographer named Alexia Sinclair. She is Australian. She was really inspirational for me, especially one photo that I will try to show it to you guys. And again, as always, all links, all notes, everything is on pedrobonato.com/podcast, and it will also be on this week's episode number. Alexia Sinclair does a lot of mythological and fashion work. And I mention her because when I was seeing her work was actually through video. It was this mini documentaries, like 5-10 minutes, that she would do about her process of making photos. And that really inspired me to try to do this in my own photos. And I'm doing this in a longer format of the podcast. But her work is not only aesthetically amazing, and her use of combining elements in Photoshop is really cool. And she has this like beautiful big prints in fine art, which is something that I aspire to do. So shout out to Alexia, she's amazing. I hope to interview her for the podcast. You should follow her work because it's really beautiful. Now, I actually do have a series and a movie recommendation since I am here. So I'm actually currently rewatching Heroes, which is a TV series from the US with superheroes and stuff. And before you poo-poo the idea, it's in the context of reimagining. So it's a lot of, let's say, superpowers that each person has and has to discover, sort of like mutant X-Men kind of a thing, but reimagined in a different way. It has elements of time travel. It's very cool, cute series, I don't know, for about, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 years ago. And I'm rewatching it. And then I noticed how a couple things, whenever you watch something that you think, this is too mundane or whatever, and I don't think that, by the way, about Heroes. I think it's a very cool series. It gives you ideas. When you have a plan and you have a vision, sometimes you will find little elements in different things that before they were completely invisible to you. But because now you have that plan, you can grab these fruits, these dates from the desert. And in my case, it was, I wanted to have a music intro for the Wanderers podcast, and I wanted to compose it myself. And I was very inspired by Sherlock's musical introduction, but it was a bit long. And then I noticed that on Heroes, the intro is basically like an eclipse scene, and I guess it lasts like 5 to 10 seconds. And that structure, thought, okay, this is what I want to do for the podcast. It's just a little sound signature that takes you into the episode. And that I got from them. Also, the idea of time travel, as you will see coming from the future and seeing this episode. If you're coming from way in the future, you will see how the little tip of what's about to happen got introduced. There is an element of time travel that I forgot. It really inspired me from Heroes, that it actually is manifested in this other story that I'm writing that will come in due time. This is the first time that I'm mentioning it publicly. But this is a cool series to watch. And now I'm going to mention something that will also refer to the future. I recently, since I went to Alexandria and now coming to CU, I was interested in taking a look at some courses about and some classes and some documentaries about Alexander the Great, but I also rewatched the Angelina Jolie, Colin Farrell original Alexander movie. And I know that a lot of people talk, like usually in the historical movies, they complain about the inaccuracy of movies. To me, that's sort of like, and I'll dedicate a whole episode about this idea of art and science at some point, but for now, I just wanted to mention, it's actually a cool movie. I don't know if it holds up in terms of the aesthetics and the frenetic pace that you're trying to do compared to what people do today, but it is actually a cool movie. And regarding the not accuracy to history, the way that I like to see this is that people usually complain that movies that are not historically or scientifically accurate are doing a disservice to the world. And I think that's absolutely incorrect, because you can use the movie for two things. One, find out what's wrong and what's not wrong. That's actual investigation. That's better than someone telling you authoritatively that this is historically accurate. And the second thing is you should criticize by creating. I can't remember who said that, but I think this applies to this. So instead of complaining about the fact that it was inaccurate, make a better version. Okay, you can't make the movie, write a better script. How would you fix the script to be completely accurate? I don't see people doing that work. So complaining about the works of art that other people did with all the constraints and all the issues that come up with, and also the importance of being completely accurate. They're trying to do a nice story. So it's a different way of seeing it. So I actually recommend the movie. It's actually a cool movie. You should watch. And then if you have a better understanding of what Alexander did and how was his history, then you can tell people, oh, this is wrong, that's wrong, this is right, this was actually this way, maybe it's even more interesting. If you're among the creative type, try to come up with a story. How would you say the story, tell the story in a better way? I think that's way more productive in terms of analyzing historical movies. Finally, I want to mention the podcast of the week that I will recommend, which is Chris Williamson's Modern Wisdom. I hope to interview him someday. Chris, I hope I get to the level that it would be interesting for you to be on my show and vice versa. He started his podcast journey about, I think, 5 years ago, and it got me really inspired, not by the size necessarily, but by his approach to the visual element of podcasting, which really got me interested, and this idea of personal development that is exposed and shown, and as you go through and have all these mentors and people in interviews and his Q&A show. So I got a lot of inspiration from him, and I think if you're into this idea of trying to come up with plans and come up with a vision, his podcast will be very useful. Finally, my toolkit, the Wanderings toolkit that I wanted to share with you. This is, again, as I mentioned in the podcast, I want these companies to eventually be sponsors. One way to do this is through affiliate links. I'm not sure by the time this episode comes out if those things will be available in terms of affiliates. If not, it's okay too, because those companies I really recommend. And I'll tell you about 3. One is Audible, that is now they're part of Amazon, but I used to listen to audiobooks since they came out. Like, you had to burn CDs and do all sorts of shenanigans to be able to listen. But it's an amazing way to really learn, to really engage your mind with the best ideas in the world. Sometimes listening to the author or a good narrator do a narration is cool. So you can go to audible.com. There will be links on the show notes. I recommend get immersed into audio. If you don't know Audible, it's a cool place. The other one is the Great Courses Plus. This has lectures from the Great Courses series. This used to be like in tapes and from a long time ago, and they have amazing professors from all over the world in all sorts of areas. And in the context of being a Renaissance person, it's so cool that you can have this 30 or 45-minute lectures that span through like many classes that you can learn about all sorts of areas. And that is one of the joys of my life, to be able to have those classes. Usually people talk up to me that, oh, Pedro, you remember so much stuff, like this Pedropedia, as I have joked before. My wife always makes that joke. It's because I'm in love with learning, I'm in love with history and stories from humanity, because we're not made of atoms, we're made of stories. I can't remember who said that quote, but it's there somewhere. And so these are 2 of the companies that I wanted to mention. The other one is Day One. Again, I keep referring to them, that it's a journaling app. It's amazing to have ideas. You can create a whole journal of your explorations of plans and vision. And I did it. I think it's amazing. I think it's a great thing to do. And finally, I wanted to mention of amazing tool is to have your own portable notebook, something that has all your plans. I have all of mine in this one. I recommend Moleskine. They're amazing. I hope they become a sponsor. If not, it's okay. There are other options in the market, but I recommend them. If it's too expensive, any notebook will do. See one that speaks to your heart, and I think that would be amazing. I wanted to close the episode with a quote that really changed the way that I think about a lot of things, because, as I mentioned, I had this very fragmented approach to things. I would do a little bit of music, a little bit of photos, a little bit of design, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Sometimes I would go longer streaks of doing like more developed work. But to my taste, they were never cohesive, they were never together. Now they are. And one of the quotes that really helped me go through rough times was this from Henry David Thoreau from Walden, and I'll read it for you right now. I learned this, at least by my experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. He will put some things behind, will pass an invisible boundary. New, universal, and more liberal laws will begin to establish themselves around and within him. Or the old laws will be expanded and interpreted in his favor in a more liberal sense, and he will live with the license of a higher order of beings. In proportion as he simplifies his life, the laws of the universe will appear less complex, And solitude will not be solitude, nor poverty, poverty, nor weakness, weakness. Now comes the part that I really like. If you have built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now put the foundations under them. In this idea of the castles in the sky that sometimes you think is such a waste of time, is just lacking the foundations. And I love this quote. I hope you find this interesting. Again, if you like the show, the best way to help out is to share the love, to share episodes. If you like this one, you can send it to a friend, send to that one friend that you think might benefit from it. It will make me very happy. If you'd like to ask me questions, just go to pedrobonatto.com/ask and I will try to answer in another episode of the show. If you want to follow me, I am at Pedro Bonatto in all social media. You can, if you're listening to the podcast, you can leave a review. There's, you know the drill. It really helps us as communicators, as independent media artists, to have the audience give us feedback and share, because that's how not only it grows, but that's how the roots really stick. And with that, I want to thank you again, mchekrin, as they say here in the Siwi language, for being with me, for sharing this time with this episode. And until next week, I remind you to follow your curiosity, go make beautiful things, and share them with the world. If you enjoyed this episode, you may enjoy this other one that I talked about choosing projects. Also, I would recommend taking a look at the interview that I did with Tamari Lana that I mentioned on this episode. It's a great interview. She's a great person. I cannot recommend enough. And those are my recommendations for you to continue your journey on the Wonderies podcast.